Victoria's hand shook so violently that the delicate porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer, a sharp, frantic clicking that cut through the damp morning air. "What did you just say to me?" she whispered, her voice tightening with a mixture of offense and raw, bubbling panic. She glared at me, her eyes darting to Ethan, looking for her shield. "Ethan, listen to her. Listen to the sheer malice in her voice. She's gloating. She's standing on my porch, in the wake of my family's tragedy, making petty threats about the locks." Ethan didn't move. He stood perfectly still beside me, his gaze fixed on the moving truck, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice flat and incredibly tired, "Chloe isn't making threats. She's just telling you what the legal notice said. 9 o'clock is the hard deadline." "And you're just going to let her speak to me that way?" Victoria hissed, stepping closer, her cashmere coat fluttering in the wind. "You're going to let this middle-class spectator insult the woman who gave you life. Hesperia Holdings is a heartless corporation, Ethan. They are the ones changing the locks, not her. She has nothing to do with this. She couldn't even afford a single square foot of this estate, let alone the deed." I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I calmly placed my leather briefcase on the stone balustrade of the porch. The twin brass latches popped open with a loud, echoey snap that seemed to reverberate across the empty courtyard. I reached inside and pulled out a thick official document, bound in a crisp blue legal folder. Stamped across the front in gold foil was the crest of the County Recorder of Deeds, alongside the freshly registered incorporation papers for Hesperia Holdings, LLC. I extended the folder toward Victoria. "What is this?" she demanded, refusing to touch it as if it were coated in venom. "I have no interest in looking at your business invoices, Chloe. I told you that at lunch weeks ago." "Take a look, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm, absolute register. "You've spent the last month trying to find out who bought your kingdom. You've spent thousands on lawyers trying to fight a ghost. Stop fighting. The ghost is standing right in front of you." Trembling, Victoria slowly reached out and snatched the folder from my hand. She flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the legal text, moving rapidly down the page until they hit the section detailing the corporate structure of Hesperia Holdings, LLC. There, listed in bold black ink as the sole principal investor, the 100% equity shareholder, and the managing director, was a single name: Chloe Larson. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to freeze the very air around us. The two movers stopped on the gravel path, holding a heavy antique mirror between them, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. Victoria's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a sickly, hollow gray. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked at the paper, then looked up at me, then back down at the paper, her mind utterly fracturing as it tried to reconcile the low-class gold digger she had despised with the multi-millionaire who now held her entire life in her hands. "No," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking, a pathetic broken sound. "No, this is a forgery. This is a trick. Ethan, look at this. She's lying. She's trying to humiliate me. Where would she get $5 million? Her father was a school teacher. She works in a mailroom." Ethan slowly took the folder from his mother's weak grip. He read the documents carefully, his eyes widening as the truth finally clicked into place. He looked at the corporate seals, the wire transfer receipts, and the absolute finality of the deed. He didn't yell. He didn't look angry. He looked at me. A profound, overwhelming sense of understanding dawning in his eyes. He remembered the flawless wedding. He remembered the Michelin-starred caterers who appeared out of nowhere. He remembered how I had calmly told him I would handle the logistics. "Chloe," Ethan breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. You bought Oak Ridge?" "I did," I replied, looking directly into my husband's eyes, offering him the absolute truth. I built a highly successful logistics corporation over the last 6 years, Ethan. I kept it private because I wanted a quiet life, and I wanted to be sure I was loved for who I am, not what I own. But when your mother tried to ruin our wedding, when she maliciously canceled our catering and tried to humiliate us to feed her own broken pride, I realized she only respects one thing: power. So, I used mine. Victoria staggered backward, her heel catching on the edge of the doormat. The porcelain teacup finally slipped from her fingers. It hit the stone porch with a sharp, shattering crash, exploding into 100 glittering shards at her feet. The last remnant of her old money illusion, smashed on the floor. "You," Victoria hissed, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and burning hatred. "You deceitful, arrogant little viper. You sat at my table, drank my tea, and quietly planned to strip me of my home. You manipulated my son, you hid your fortune, and you systematically destroyed my life." "I didn't destroy your life, Victoria," I said, stepping forward, my flats crunching softly against the broken porcelain. "Your own vanity destroyed your life. Your husband's bad investments dug the hole, and your desperate need to look superior to everyone else kept you digging. I didn't default on your mortgages. I didn't bounce your checks. You did that all on your own. I simply waited at the bottom of the hill to catch the asset when you dropped it." Right on cue, a white utility van pulled up the driveway, stopping behind the moving truck. A man in a blue uniform stepped out, carrying a heavy metal toolkit. The locksmith had arrived. It was exactly 9 a.m. Victoria looked at the locksmith, then looked at Ethan, tears finally spilling over her perfectly painted cheeks. She grabbed Ethan's arms, her expensive nails digging into his jacket. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice completely stripped of its dignity, reduced to a desperate, shrill screech. "You can't let her do this. This is your childhood home. Your grandfather built this place. Tell her to call it off. Tell her to let me stay. We can form a new agreement. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever she wants. Just don't let her throw me out into the street." Ethan looked down at his mother's hands on his coat. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down, untangled her fingers, and stepped back, standing firmly by my side. "You lied to me, Mom," Ethan said, his voice dripping with a quiet, devastating sadness. "You lied to me about Dad's estate. You lied to me about the catering. You tried to ruin the happiest day of my life just to hurt the woman I love. Chloe didn't throw you out. You threw yourself out the moment you chose cruelty over family." Victoria looked at her son, realizing with absolute certainty that her reign was over. The golden cage was empty. Her subjects had left. Without another word, she pulled her black cashmere coat tightly around her shoulders, lifted her chin in a final pathetic attempt to maintain her pride, and marched down the steps. She didn't look back at the mansion. She didn't look back at us. She walked straight to a waiting car she had hired, stepped inside, and vanished down the long, winding driveway. The locksmith immediately went to work, the metallic sound of drilling and clinking tumblers filling the morning air as he began replacing the locks on the heavy oak doors. Ethan and I stood on the porch, watching the fog slowly lift from the sprawling lawns. The estate was quiet now. The peeling paint and overgrown weeds didn't look intimidating anymore. They just looked like a project waiting to be managed. Ethan turned to me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pulling me close against the autumn chill. "So," he murmured, a faint, genuine smile finally returning to his face. "An 8-figure logistics company?" 8-figure, I confirmed, resting my head against his shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, Ethan, but I promise you, from here on out, there are no more secrets between us." "I don't care about the money, Chloe," he whispered, kissing the top of my head. "I just care about you. But what exactly are we going to do with a 4-generation colonial mansion?" I looked up at the grand white pillars, a calm, deeply satisfying sense of peace washing over me. Well, I smiled, the architecture is beautiful, but the history is a bit toxic. I think we're going to completely gut the interior. We'll fix the paint, restore the gardens, and strip the Vance name off the front gates. We're going to turn this place into something it's never been before. And what's that? Ethan asked. A home, I replied softly. Wealth is a loud thing when you don't actually have it. But true power is the quiet satisfaction of rewriting the story on your own terms and watching the walls of the old empire fall, while you build something beautiful from the ruins. The world assumes that power always speaks with a loud voice. They think it wears flashing diamonds, drives roaring sports cars, and demands the center of every room it enters. But they are wrong. True power is quiet. True power is the silence that falls over a room just before a storm hits. For 3 years, I lived in that silence. Every morning, I wake up at precisely 5 a.m. I brew a single cup of black coffee in my quiet, minimalist penthouse overlooking the city skyline. From up here, the cars below look like tiny ants rushing aimlessly through concrete mazes. People fighting over scraps, completely unaware of who holds the strings to their lives. To the world, and especially to my ex-husband, Richard Thorne, I was nobody. During our 2 years of marriage, he looked at me and saw a blank slate. A quiet, unassuming woman who preferred simple cotton dresses over designer labels. A woman who worked a vague administrative desk job from home, and who never argued when he demanded she pay half the rent for our cramped, drafty suburban apartment. Richard was a man obsessed with the illusion of status. He spent his entire paycheck on leased BMWs, tailored suits he couldn't afford, and expensive dinners meant solely to impress his shallow friends. And throughout it all, he treated me like a financial anchor dragging him down. I still remember the exact night our marriage ended. It was raining heavily, the droplets hammering against the cheap glass of our living room window. Richard had come home late, smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't his, and dropped a stack of papers on our worn-out coffee table. "I'm out, Evelyn," he had said, not even looking me in the eye, as he loosened his silk tie. "I can't do this anymore. I'm a man destined for high society, and you're just a ghost. You have no ambition, no style, and no money. I'm drowning in mediocrity just by standing near you." I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed. I had simply looked up from my book, my expression completely serene. "Is that truly what you think, Richard?" "It's the reality," he sneered, tossing his gold watch onto the table. "I'm dating someone who actually matters now. Someone from a family that can actually elevate me. We're filing for an uncontested divorce. You keep your pathetic little savings, and I keep my future. Don't look for me, and don't expect a single dime of alimony. You wouldn't even know how to spend it." I signed the papers the very next morning, without a single word of protest. Richard took his leased car, his oversized ego, and his designer suits, leaving me in that empty apartment. He had no idea that my vague administrative job was running Aegis Global Holdings, a $1 trillion private venture capital firm that quietly owned the very infrastructure of the city he walked on. I had kept my wealth completely separated from our marriage via a network of ironclad blind trusts, waiting to see if he loved me for who I was. He failed the test completely. 3 years passed in blissful peace, until yesterday. I was sitting at my marble kitchen island when my personal assistant, Clara, delivered the morning mail. Among the neat stacks of corporate reports was a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope. The cardstock was absurdly expensive, finished with gold leaf edges and sealed with a heavy burgundy wax stamp. I opened it. Inside was a lavish, over-designed wedding invitation. Arthur Sterling requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of his daughter, Chloe Sterling, to Richard Thorne. Celebrated at the Whispering Pines Historic Estate. I stared at Richard's name printed in raised gold filigree. A cold, slow smile touched my lips. He had actually managed to climb his way into the Sterling family, the owners of a massive tech manufacturing empire. But it wasn't the invitation that caught my attention. It was the neon green sticky note, slapped carelessly onto the back of the heavy cardstock. Written in Richard's unmistakable, chaotic handwriting were the words, "Evelyn, I thought you should see what a real wedding looks like. I threw you a bone and put you on the guest list. Please try to wear something decent so you don't embarrass me in front of high society. Or, if you're still struggling to pay rent, just show up around the back. I'm sure the catering staff can find some dishes for you to wash to earn a quick buck. See you there." I held the note between my fingers, feeling the cheap texture of his malice. He hadn't sent this out of kindness. He had sent it to twist the knife, to validate his own fragile ego, and to publicly display his newly acquired wealth to the woman he thought he had left in the dust. I didn't tear the note up. I didn't get angry. Instead, I picked up my secure satellite smartphone and dialed a direct encrypted number. The line rang once, before a deep, fiercely loyal voice answered. "Chief Executive Vance, this is Marcus. Orders?" "Marcus," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Clear my schedule for this upcoming Saturday afternoon. I have a wedding to attend." There was a brief pause on the line. "A wedding, ma'am? Should I arrange the security detail and the motorcade?" "No," I replied, staring out at the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. "Keep it quiet. One unmarked rental vehicle. But tell our corporate legal and acquisition teams to pull up the complete financial file on Sterling Tech Industries. I want a full breakdown of their liabilities on my desk within the hour." "Understood, Chief Executive. It will be done." I hung up the phone, took a slow sip of my black coffee, and looked at the gold leaf invitation. Richard wanted a show. It would be a shame not to give him one. The next morning, the glass doors of Aegis Global Holdings slid open silently as I walked through the lobby. The building was a monolith of black steel and reinforced glass, towering 60 stories above the heart of the city. Every employee I passed froze, bowing their heads respectfully, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. To them, I was the shadow sovereign, the anonymous force that could crush a multi-billion-dollar bank with a single stroke of a pen. I entered my private office on the top floor. The room was vast, bordered by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire state. On my massive mahogany desk sat a thick, crimson folder. Marcus was already standing by the window, his arms crossed, his tailored suit hiding the frame of a seasoned military veteran. "The reports you requested, ma'am," Marcus said, stepping forward and opening the folder for me. "And I must say, your timing is impeccable." I sat down, pulling the documents closer. My eyes scanned the financial figures with practiced precision. "Give me the summary, Marcus." "Sterling Tech Industries is a house of cards," Marcus explained, pointing to a graph showing a steep downward trend. "On the outside, they look like an unkillable titan. They boast about luxury contracts, high-tech manufacturing, and political connections. But internally, they overextended on their new microchip production facilities last year. They are currently facing a massive liquidity crisis. If they do not secure an immediate cash injection, they will default on their sovereign bonds by the end of the month. They are facing complete public bankruptcy." "And who holds the key to their survival?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We do," Marcus smiled coldly. 3 weeks ago, through one of our anonymous shell corporations, Aegis Capital Ventures, they applied for an emergency corporate bailout, a credit line of exactly $500 million. The paperwork has been thoroughly vetted by our board. It's sitting right there, waiting for your final signature to authorize the wire transfer. I leaned back in my leather chair, tapping my fingers rhythmically against the desk. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a ticking time bomb. Richard had spent the last year courting Chloe Sterling, believing he was hitching his wagon to a star that would take him to the peak of the financial world. He thought he was marrying into a dynasty of untouchable billionaires. He had no earthly idea that the entire Sterling family was currently on their knees, begging a shadow entity for a financial lifeline just to keep the lights on. And he certainly didn't know that the shadow entity was the ex-wife he used to scream at for spending $20 too much on groceries. "Who is handling the negotiations from the Sterling side?" I asked. "Arthur Sterling himself, along with his daughter Chloe," Marcus replied. "They are desperate, ma'am. They have been calling our corporate secretaries every hour, pleading for the contract to be finalized. The moment the markets open on Monday, their stock price will plummet to zero." I looked down at the $500 million contract. A flawless, brutal plan crystallized in my mind. "Marcus, call Arthur Sterling's legal representation immediately," I ordered, my voice dropping an octave, filled with an undeniable authority. "Tell them that Aegis Global has reviewed their application. Tell them the bailout is provisionally approved." Marcus blinked, slightly surprised. "Approved, ma'am? Just like that?" "With one very specific non-negotiable condition," I continued, a sharp, dangerous glint in my eyes. "Tell them that the chief executive of Aegis Global does not do business over digital signatures or through low-level attorneys for a sum this large. The contract must be signed in person, and because my schedule is incredibly tight, the signing will take place this Saturday afternoon at their private venue, the Whispering Pines Estate. Tell them I will personally arrive during the wedding reception to execute the document." Marcus's face broke into a wide, appreciative grin as the sheer gravity of the trap dawned on him. "And they will have no choice but to comply." "A drowning man doesn't complain about the color of the life preserver you throw him," I said, picking up a sleek black fountain pen. I signed my initials to the provisional approval page with a smooth, unwavering hand. "They will agree to host me. They will prepare a private suite at the venue, and they will wait for the anonymous CEO of Aegis to save their lives right in the middle of Richard's grand celebration." "What about the identity mask, ma'am? They only know the firm's name. They have never seen your face. Let them keep guessing until the very last second," I said, closing the folder with a sharp, echoing thud. "Let Richard enjoy his morning. Let him feel like the king of the world, because the higher he climbs, the harder he is going to hit the ground." Saturday arrived with a clear, brilliant blue sky. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and expensive floral arrangements. The Whispering Pines estate was located an hour outside the city. A massive, historic stone manor surrounded by hundreds of acres of manicured gardens, soaring fountains, and iron gates guarded by private security. As I drove through the gates, I looked at the long line of vehicles crawling up the cobblestone driveway. There were sparkling Lamborghinis, sleek silver Bentleys, and pristine black Rolls-Royces. The high society that Richard so desperately craved had arrived in full force. I had deliberately chosen not to use my personal armored limousine or my security detail for the arrival. Instead, I drove a modest, unbranded gray sedan, the kind of car you see in a supermarket parking lot and forget 2 seconds later. My outfit was equally calculated. I wore a simple, beautifully tailored linen dress in a muted beige tone. It had no visible designer logos, no flashy gold buttons, and no sparkling gems. To an untrained shallow eye like Richard's, it looked like a cheap off-the-rack garment from a department store. To an expert in high-end luxury, the immaculate, hand-stitched Italian silk lining would speak volumes, but Richard was far too blind to notice true quality. My hair was tied back in a neat, professional low bun, and I wore flat leather shoes. I parked the sedan in the furthest guest lot, stepped out, and walked calmly toward the grand entrance of the estate. The air was filled with the sound of a live string quartet playing classical melodies. Wealthy guests mingled on the emerald green lawns, sipping champagne from crystal flutes and flashing artificial smiles. I walked past them like a ghost, unnoticed, untouched, perfectly invisible in my simplicity. As I approached the grand stone archway leading to the main courtyard, a loud, obnoxious laugh echoed over the classical music. I paused. Standing near a massive marble fountain, surrounded by a group of 5 men in identical luxury tuxedos, was Richard. He looked exactly as he did 3 years ago, though perhaps a bit softer around the edges, from a lifestyle funded by someone else's money. His hair was slicked back with heavy gel, a massive diamond watch gleamed on his wrist, and a smug, boastful grin was plastered across his face. He was holding a glass of high-end champagne, gesturing wildly as he spoke to his groomsmen. "I'm telling you, boys, it's all about knowing your worth," Richard bragged, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You can't let yourself get dragged down by people who don't have the vision to achieve greatness. You have to cut the dead weight." One of his friends, a short man with a predatory smile, nodded. "True that, Rich. Look at you now, marrying into the Sterling Empire. You're set for life, man." "Exactly," Richard smirked, taking a sip of his drink. "And to think, just a few years ago, I was stuck with a woman who thought a wild night out was buying a book and cooking pasta at home. A total zero. I actually invited her today, just so she could see what real success looks like. I doubt she'll show up, though. She probably couldn't find a dress that didn't have patches on it." I stood just 10 feet away, watching them. My heart rate didn't elevate by a single beat. My hands remained perfectly steady. I simply waited until the laughter died down, and then I stepped out from the shadow of the archway. "Hello, Richard." The laughter stopped instantly. Richard froze, his glass stopping halfway to his mouth. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto me. For a fraction of a second, a flash of pure panic crossed his face, the instinctual fear of a man seeing a ghost. But within a moment, that panic was replaced by a wave of intense, venomous arrogance. He looked me up and down, his eyes taking in my simple linen dress, my lack of jewelry, and my flat shoes. A cruel, triumphant sneer spread across his lips. "Well, well, well," Richard announced loudly, making sure everyone around the fountain could hear him. "Look what the wind blew in. Boys, look at this. She actually had the nerve to show up." The groomsmen stepped back, eyeing me with smirk-filled expressions, crossing their arms. "Evelyn," Richard said, walking over to me with a slow, exaggerated stride, as if he were a king inspecting a peasant. "I have to admit I'm shocked. I didn't think you'd actually have the guts to come here. But then again, maybe you heard about the free food in the open bar? God knows you probably haven't eaten a decent meal since the divorce." "The invitation said the honor of my presence was requested," I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. "I merely chose to honor the request." Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The invitation was a joke, Evelyn, a reality check. But look at you. Jesus, I told you on the note to wear something decent. What is that? Did you buy that dress at a thrift store? You look like you're going to a library, not the wedding of the century. You are completely embarrassing me just by standing in my courtyard." "Your courtyard?" I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You know what I mean," he snapped, his voice growing hostile. "The Sterling estate. My new home. The world I belong to now. Look around you, Evelyn. Look at the cars, the people, the wealth. This is how real people live. This is what you could never understand. I spent 2 years trying to drag you out of the mud. And you just wanted to stay there." One of his friends chimed in. "Hey, Rich, is this the ex?" "Man, you weren't kidding. She really does look like a charity case." Richard smirked, clearly fueled by the approval of his peers. He leaned in closer to me, lowering his voice, but keeping the venom sharp. "Listen to me, Evelyn. I'm going to be generous. The main ceremony is about to start in the grand ballroom, and the guests inside are actual billionaires, politicians, and CEOs. People who matter. You do not belong in there. You'll stick out like a sore thumb in that pathetic little outfit. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and flicked it toward my chest. It fluttered down, landing on the cobblestones near my feet. "Take that," Richard sneered. "Go around to the back entrance by the kitchens. Tell the head chef that Richard Thorne sent you. I'm sure they have an extra apron. You can spend the afternoon washing wine glasses in the back where nobody has to look at you. At least that way you can make a quick buck and eat some leftovers. Don't ruin my big day, Evelyn. Get out of my sight." I looked down at the $100 bill lying in the dirt. Then I looked back up at Richard. I didn't yell. I didn't get defensive. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye, and a small, calm, terrifyingly serene smile spread across my face. "Enjoy your afternoon, Richard," I said softly, my voice filled with a quiet weight that made his smile falter for a split second. "Make sure you enjoy every single second of it." Without waiting for his reply, I turned around and walked calmly toward the grand ballroom doors, leaving him and his friends standing by the fountain. The grand ballroom of the Whispering Pines estate was a spectacle of blinding, opulent wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted, gold-painted ceiling, casting a warm, shimmering glow over hundreds of high society guests dressed in flawless black tie attire. The air hummed with the quiet elite murmurs of corporate mergers, political favors, and old money. At the front of the room stood an altar adorned with thousands of imported white roses. Richard was already standing there, adjusting his gold cufflinks, flashing his white teeth at a professional photography crew. But behind the scenes, away from the glittering crowd, a completely different reality was unfolding. In the private, high-security VIP holding suite overlooking the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with absolute terror. Arthur Sterling, the patriarch of the Sterling tech empire, was pacing the floor frantically, sweat breaking through his expensive makeup. His daughter, Chloe Sterling, the beautiful, fiercely arrogant bride, was gripping her diamond-encrusted bridal bouquet so tightly her knuckles were white. "Where are they?" Arthur shouted at his chief legal counsel, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "The markets open in less than 48 hours. If the Aegis Global chief executive doesn't sign this contract today, the banks will call in our loans on Monday morning. We are ruined, Chloe. Do you understand? Everything we own is gone." Chloe rubbed her temples, her breathing shallow. "Dad, calm down. Their legal team said the chief executive accepted the terms. They said the CEO would be here in person during the reception to finalize the signature. They wouldn't back out now." "You don't understand how Aegis operates." Arthur slammed his fist onto a glass table. "They are ruthless. They don't care about our legacy. They don't care about your wedding. We are a speck of dust to them. If the CEO decides they don't like the look of our quarterly projections, they will walk away and leave us to rot." Just then, the heavy oak doors of the private suite opened. Marcus stepped into the room, his towering presence immediately commanding attention. Arthur ran toward him, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Marcus, thank God. Is the chief executive here? Is the wire transfer ready? We have the physical documents printed and waiting." Marcus didn't smile. His face was an unreadable mask of military discipline. "The chief executive has arrived at the venue and has personally verified the terms. However, the CEO has requested that the signing not take place in hiding. The chief executive wishes to view the estate's main hall and will execute the document publicly in the ballroom right before the reception begins." Arthur gasped. "Publicly? In front of all our guests? But nobody has ever seen the face of the Aegis founder. It's the most guarded secret in the financial world." "Those are the terms," Marcus said coldly, stepping aside to hold the door open. "If you wish to save your company, you will walk out into that ballroom right now, find the chief executive, and sign the papers. The choice is yours, Mr. Sterling." "We'll do it," Chloe said, her voice shaking as she stood up, adjusting her long, flowing silk veil. "We have no choice. Dad, let's go. We have to find them." Down in the ballroom, the music shifted. The heavy, resonant tones of the wedding march began to echo through the massive speakers. The hundreds of guests took their seats, filling the long rows of gold-rimmed chairs. Richard stood at the altar, puffing out his chest, looking down the aisle with an insufferable look of triumph. I had taken a seat at the very back of the room, sitting quietly in the last row, completely alone. I watched as the heavy double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. But it wasn't the bride who walked down the aisle first. It was Arthur Sterling, flanked by 3 senior corporate attorneys holding heavy leather folders, walking with a frantic, desperate speed. Behind him came Chloe, her stunning bridal gown trailing behind her, but her face was completely pale, devoid of the joy a bride should have. They weren't looking at the guests. They were scanning the crowd with wide, panicked eyes, searching for a phantom. The guests whispered in confusion. The music faltered. The traditional wedding procession had completely broken down. Richard's smug smile faltered as he saw his future father-in-law and bride marching down the aisle like soldiers entering a battlefield rather than a wedding ceremony. He stepped down from the altar, his microphone picking up his confused voice. "Arthur? Chloe? What's going on? The music just started. Why are the lawyers here?" Arthur ignored him completely. He stopped in the middle of the aisle, turning his head in circles. "Where are they? Marcus said they were in the hall." I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. The rustle of my simple linen dress was silent. But as I stepped into the center of the main aisle, at the back of the room, Marcus appeared from the shadows, stepping into position exactly 1 pace behind my right shoulder. Chloe's eyes darted to the back of the room. She looked at Marcus, recognizing him instantly as the high-level executor of Aegis Global. And then her gaze shifted to the woman standing in front of him. She looked at my face. She looked at my calm, unbothered eyes. She looked at the terrifying authority radiating from my silent posture. Chloe froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The expensive bouquet of white roses slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a soft, echoing thud. The entire ballroom went completely silent. "Chloe?" Richard asked, running down the aisle toward her, his face twisting in confusion. "What is wrong with you? Why did you drop the flowers?" He turned his head, following her gaze to the back of the room. When his eyes landed on me, his face hardened into pure, ugly rage. "Evelyn!" Richard roared, his voice amplifying through the ballroom speakers. "Are you kidding me right now? I told you to stay in the back. Get this pathetic woman out of here. She's trying to ruin my wedding." He took 3 aggressive steps toward me, pointing a finger at my face. "You broke, jealous piece of garbage. You think you can just stand there in your thrift store dress and look at my bride? Get her out of here before I personally throw her into the mud." "Richard, shut your mouth," Arthur Sterling suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with an absolute primitive terror. Richard blinked, completely derailed. "What? Arthur, she's just my penniless ex-wife. She's a nobody. But Chloe didn't hear him. She was already moving. Ignoring her long silk train, ignoring the hundreds of elite guests watching in breathless shock, the billionaire heiress ran past Richard. She stumbled, her knees shaking violently, until she reached the back of the room. In front of the entire high society of the city, Chloe Sterling stopped 2 feet away from me. Her face was completely white, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. She bowed her head so low her forehead nearly touched her knees, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her dress. "Ma'am?" Chloe stammered, her voice echoing through the silent, horrified ballroom. Chief Executive Evelyn. I didn't know. Oh my God, please forgive us. I had no idea you would grace our venue with your presence. Please tell me our corporate contract is safe. The grand ballroom of the Whispering Pines estate was a spectacle of blinding, opulent wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted, gold-painted ceiling, casting a warm, shimmering glow over hundreds of high society guests dressed in flawless black tie attire. The air hummed with the quiet elite murmurs of corporate mergers, political favors, and old money. At the front of the room stood an altar adorned with thousands of imported white roses. Richard was already standing there, adjusting his gold cufflinks, flashing his white teeth at a professional photography crew. But behind the scenes, away from the glittering crowd, a completely different reality was unfolding. In the private high-security VIP holding suite overlooking the ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with absolute terror. Arthur Sterling, the patriarch of the Sterling tech empire, was pacing the floor frantically, sweat breaking through his expensive makeup. His daughter, Chloe Sterling, the beautiful, fiercely arrogant bride, was gripping her diamond-encrusted bridal bouquet so tightly her knuckles were white. "Where are they?" Arthur shouted at his chief legal counsel, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "The markets open in less than 48 hours. If the Aegis Global chief executive doesn't sign this contract today, the banks will call in our loans on Monday morning. We are ruined, Chloe. Do you understand? Everything we own is gone." Chloe rubbed her temples, her breathing shallow. "Dad, calm down. Their legal team said the chief executive accepted the terms. They said the CEO would be here in person during the reception to finalize the signature. They wouldn't back out now." "You don't understand how Aegis operates." Arthur slammed his fist onto a glass table. "They are ruthless. They don't care about our legacy. They don't care about your wedding. We are a speck of dust to them. If the CEO decides they don't like the look of our quarterly projections, they will walk away and leave us to rot." Just then, the heavy oak doors of the private suite opened. Marcus stepped into the room, his towering presence immediately commanding attention. Arthur ran toward him, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Marcus, thank God. Is the chief executive here? Is the wire transfer ready? We have the physical documents printed and waiting." Marcus didn't smile. His face was an unreadable mask of military discipline. "The chief executive has arrived at the venue and has personally verified the terms. However, the CEO has requested that the signing not take place in hiding. The chief executive wishes to view the estate's main hall and will execute the document publicly, in the ballroom, right before the reception begins." Arthur gasped. "Publicly? In front of all our guests? But nobody has ever seen the face of the Aegis founder. It's the most guarded secret in the financial world." "Those are the terms," Marcus said coldly, stepping aside to hold the door open. "If you wish to save your company, you will walk out into that ballroom right now, find the chief executive, and sign the papers. The choice is yours, Mr. Sterling." "We'll do it," Chloe said, her voice shaking as she stood up, adjusting her long, flowing silk veil. "We have no choice. Dad, let's go. We have to find them." Down in the ballroom, the music shifted. The heavy, resonant tones of the wedding march began to echo through the massive speakers. The hundreds of guests took their seats, filling the long rows of gold-rimmed chairs. Richard stood at the altar, puffing out his chest, looking down the aisle with an insufferable look of triumph. I had taken a seat at the very back of the room, sitting quietly in the last row, completely alone. I watched as the heavy double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. But it wasn't the bride who walked down the aisle first. It was Arthur Sterling, flanked by 3 senior corporate attorneys, holding heavy leather folders, walking with a frantic, desperate speed. Behind him came Chloe, her stunning bridal gown trailing behind her, but her face was completely pale, devoid of the joy a bride should have. They weren't looking at the guests. They were scanning the crowd with wide, panicked eyes, searching for a phantom. The guests whispered in confusion. The music faltered. The traditional wedding procession had completely broken down. Richard's smug smile faltered as he saw his future father-in-law and bride marching down the aisle like soldiers entering a battlefield rather than a wedding ceremony. He stepped down from the altar, his microphone picking up his confused voice. "Arthur? Chloe? What's going on? The music just started. Why are the lawyers here?" Arthur ignored him completely. He stopped in the middle of the aisle, turning his head in circles. "Where are they? Marcus said they were in the hall." I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. The rustle of my simple linen dress was silent, but as I stepped into the center of the main aisle at the back of the room, Marcus appeared from the shadows, stepping into position exactly 1 pace behind my right shoulder. Chloe's eyes darted to the back of the room. She looked at Marcus, recognizing him instantly as the high-level executor of Aegis Global. And then her gaze shifted to the woman standing in front of him. She looked at my face. She looked at my calm, unbothered eyes. She looked at the terrifying authority radiating from my silent posture. Chloe froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The expensive bouquet of white roses slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished marble floor with a soft, echoing thud. The entire ballroom went completely silent. "Chloe?" Richard asked, running down the aisle toward her, his face twisting in confusion. "What is wrong with you? Why did you drop the flowers?" He turned his head, following her gaze to the back of the room. When his eyes landed on me, his face hardened into pure, ugly rage. "Evelyn?" Richard roared, his voice amplifying through the ballroom speakers. "Are you kidding me right now? I told you to stay in the back. Get this pathetic woman out of here. She's trying to ruin my wedding." He took 3 aggressive steps toward me, pointing a finger at my face. "You broke, jealous piece of garbage. You think you can just stand there in your thrift store dress and look at my bride? Get her out of here before I personally throw her into the mud." "Richard, shut your mouth!" Arthur Sterling suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with an absolute primitive terror. Richard blinked, completely derailed. "What? Arthur, she's just my penniless ex-wife. She's a nobody, But Chloe didn't hear him. She was already moving. Ignoring her long silk train, ignoring the hundreds of elite guests watching in breathless shock, the billionaire heiress ran past Richard. She stumbled, her knees shaking violently, until she reached the back of the room. In front of the entire high society of the city, Chloe Sterling stopped 2 feet away from me. Her face was completely white, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. She bowed her head so low, her forehead nearly touched her knees, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her dress. "Ma'am," Chloe stammered, her voice echoing through the silent, horrified ballroom. "Chief Executive Evelyn. I didn't know. Oh my God, please forgive us. I had no idea you would grace our venue with your presence. Please tell me our corporate contract is safe." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grand clock at the back of the ballroom. Nobody breathed. Hundreds of high society elites sat frozen in their seats, their mouths open in complete, paralyzing disbelief. Richard looked like he had been struck by lightning. His jaw had dropped so low it looked unhinged. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, hollow gray. He staggered backward, his hands trembling as he stared at his billionaire bride bowing before the woman he had just offered $100 to wash dishes. Richard choked out, his voice squeaking. "What are you doing? Stand up. Why are you calling her ma'am? That's Evelyn. She's a nobody. She works a pathetic desk job. She's broke." Arthur Sterling sprinted down the aisle, his face purple with rage. He reached Richard, and without a single second of hesitation, struck him across the face with a heavy, open-handed slap. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. "Shut up, you idiot!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He turned to me, dropping his head instantly, his entire body trembling as he bowed alongside his daughter. "Chief Executive Vance, please, I beg of you, do not listen to this man. He is nothing to us. He is an outsider. We had no idea he had any connection to you. If we had known, he would have never set foot in this county, let alone this estate. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, looking down at the Sterling family bowing at my feet. Then I looked past them, locking my icy eyes onto Richard, who was clutching his reddened cheek, his knees buckling beneath him, as the horrific, crushing reality finally began to pierce through his thick skull. The realization was a slow, agonizing poison inside his mind. He was looking at my simple dress. He was looking at Marcus. He was looking at the fear of the untouchable Sterling family, and finally, the puzzle pieces clicked together. The vague administrative job, the lack of financial worry during the divorce, the quiet confidence. He hadn't left a financial anchor. He had walked away from the person who owned the entire ocean. Evelyn, Richard whispered, his voice cracking, a look of pure, unadulterated horror in his eyes. You, Aegis Global? I didn't need to. I turned my attention to Marcus, who stepped forward, holding out the thick crimson folder containing the $500 million emergency bailout agreement. The contract, Chief Executive, Marcus announced, his voice clear and resonant. It requires your final physical signature to authorize the immediate wire transfer to Sterling Tech Industries. Arthur Sterling looked up, his eyes wide with desperate hope. Please, ma'am, save our legacy. We will do anything. We will sign any rider. We will cast this man out into the streets right now. I reached out and took the folder from Marcus's hands. I opened it, looking down at the pristine, crisp paper, the raised corporate seals, the culmination of the Sterling family's entire life's work. Arthur, I said, my voice quiet, smooth, and utterly terrifying in its calmness. When I do business, I do not merely invest in numbers. I invest in character. I invest in the values of the families that Aegis Global associates with. I looked over at Richard, who was now trembling so violently he had to grip a guest chair just to remain standing. Your future son-in-law informed me out in the courtyard that I look like a charity case, I continued softly, the words cutting through the room like razor blades. He told me I belonged in the kitchen, washing dishes to earn a quick buck. He threw $100 bill at my feet in the dirt. Chloe let out a sharp, horrified gasp, turning her head to glare at Richard with a look of murderous, venomous hatred. Arthur's eyes widened so large, the veins in his temples looked ready to burst. Ma'am, please, Arthur begged, dropping to both knees on the marble floor. He is nothing to us. The wedding is off. It is cancelled. We will ruin him, I swear it to you. Do not punish our company for his pathetic arrogance. An empire built on the foundation of such shallow, cruel arrogance is not an empire worth saving, I said smoothly. With a slow, deliberate movement, I gripped the top of the $500 million contract, and then, with a single, sharp, fluid motion, I tore the paper completely in half. The sound of the thick cardstock ripping apart echoed through the silent ballroom like a thunderclap. The bailout is officially denied, I announced, tossing the torn pieces of the contract onto the floor. They fluttered down, landing right next to Chloe's ruined bridal bouquet. Aegis Global will be shorting Sterling Tech Industries the moment the markets open on Monday morning. I expect your corporate liquidation papers to be on my desk by Wednesday. Arthur Sterling let out a hollow, broken wail, collapsing entirely onto the floor, his face buried in his hands. His entire life's work, his family's legacy, his wealth, destroyed in a single second because of the fragile ego of the parasite his daughter had chosen to marry. Chloe snapped. She stood up, her face twisted in pure, unbridled fury. She lunged toward Richard, screaming at the top of her lungs, ripping her own veil off and throwing it at his face. You ruined us, she shrieked, striking Richard across the chest. You pathetic, arrogant piece of trash. You brought a god into our house and insulted her. Get out! Get out of my sight! Security! Arthur roared from the floor, his voice choked with tears. Get this garbage out of my estate. Throw him out. Break him if he resists. 4 massive, heavily armed estate security guards rushed down the aisle. They didn't care about Richard's expensive custom tuxedo. They grabbed him by his arms, twisting them painfully behind his back, lifting him completely off his feet. "Evelyn, please!" Richard began to scream, tears finally bursting from his eyes as pure, unadulterated panic took over. He thrashed in the grip of the guards, looking back at me as they dragged him down the aisle toward the exit. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Please, Evelyn, we were married, we loved each other. You can't do this to me. I'll do anything. I'll wash the dishes. Save me." I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, watching him as he was violently dragged through the grand double doors. The security guards carried him out of the ballroom, down the steps of the manor, and marched him all the way to the main iron gates of the estate. The sky, which had been clear all morning, suddenly opened up with a torrential downpour. The guards opened the gates and threw Richard Dorn face first into the thick, freezing mud outside the property lines. His diamond watch shattered against the rocks. His custom tuxedo was instantly soaked in black dirt. He lay there in the pouring rain, on his knees, staring through the iron bars of the world he had just been permanently exiled from, sobbing uncontrollably, completely and utterly ruined. Back in the ballroom, I turned around, completely ignoring the weeping Sterling family and the terrified whispers of the guests. "Marcus," I said quietly, adjusting the sleeve of my simple linen dress. "Bring the car around." "Right away, Chief Executive," Marcus smiled, bowing his head respectfully. I walked out of the grand ballroom, my flat leather shoes stepping over the torn pieces of the $500 million contract. I walked through the stone archway, past the marble fountain, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. As I drove my modest gray sedan back through the iron gates, I didn't even look down at the pathetic figure of my ex-husband crying in the mud by the side of the road. He wanted me to see what real success looked like. It was a shame he had to lose absolutely everything just to learn the lesson.